if your dating life consists of attracting emotionally unavailable people, then being their unpaid therapist, ignoring every red flag, doing everything for them, and then feeling exhausted, congratulations, you might be not too loving. You might be codependent. Let's talk about it today on the 20th episode of the Connection Catalyst podcast. I'm Karolina, the Connection Catalyst, and I'm here to explain the difference between codependency and people pleasing and how it all plays out within narcissism, how these patterns are created, and then what we can do about it in order to not feel like we are losing our sense of self completely for the other person and keep attracting the people that we don't want to attract into our life. So, first of all, most people think that narcissism and codependency are personality types, but this is not true because these are the patterns from childhood that were the coping strategies to face the dysfunction that was happening in the family dynamic. So they are the adaptations to relational unsafety. So the children learn in childhood that they can't rely on people to take their best interest into consideration, and they need the strategy to survive emotionally. And narcissism and codependency are actually two different responses, but to the same kind of wound in childhood. So if there was lack of safe love, if the love was conditional, if there was lack of attunement of the parent to the child, and the parent didn't really care about the child's needs, or there was just any kind of emotional unsafety, these patterns of narcissism and codependency were created. So one thing that I want to say that on the outside, the dysfunctional families can look very amazing. You know, they can be very wealthy, they can be caring, they can seem to be close to each other, they can be spiritual, they can be high achieving and so on. But emotionally, they might be still very, very unsafe because no one teaches us at school how to navigate our emotions, unfortunately. And that's why even if a parent can sacrifice everything to the child, doesn't mean that the child will have all the emotional needs met, because the parent can meet their own emotional needs through the child while not caring consciously or subconsciously about the child's needs. So the example could be when the parent is putting so much pressure on the child to achieve success in something that they failed in, right? Or when the parent needs control or validation through being a good parent, or when someone is, for example, an unhealthy giver Enneagram type, and they need someone to depend on them to feel valuable and to feel worthy of love. So all of this is dysfunction. And even if the dysfunction is hidden or mild, it still can create this narcissistic or codependent pattern in relationships. Because in these dysfunctional dynamics, every person learns that they are the ones that have to fight for their own needs being met, because no one else will meet their needs. And so now the child stops trusting that love can be given unconditionally just because they are. They feel like they need to have a strategy rather than authenticity in order to have a happy life in this family, or at least not to bother parents, not to be punished, not to get critics, and so on. So their nervous system needs to adapt to this emotional unpredictability, or maybe to the manipulation that they had from their parents, or maybe even emotional abandonment, or just parents being inconsistent in how they give love or how they care about the child. So that's how these patterns are shaped, whether it's narcissism or codependency. This is where it stems from, the wounding in childhood. So now let's talk about the difference between people pleasing and codependency, because they are interconnected, but they are not the same thing. People pleasing is kind of milder version of codependency because it's more like a behavior, whereas codependency is the whole relationship pattern. So people pleasing can be usually displayed in order to avoid conflict, in order to want approval, in order to make other people happy, and in order to not to disappoint others, or to just, say yes when you mean no, and so on. But codependency goes much deeper, because codependency actually becomes our whole identity. So it kind of like dictates our sense of self through other people. And it's like a way to maintain relationships. So it's kind of like similar, but not really the same, because codependency is the whole unconscious survival strategy. And people pleasing is just about like, okay, I want people to like me. And then codependency is like, I need this relationship to work and to feel emotionally safe and valuable. So if I attach sense of self to the other person, then my whole life becomes about them. And this is what codependency is. That's why codependency is more intense than people pleasing. So there's like emotional fusion with the other person. There could be obsession. There could be rescuing. There could be loss of self if this other person is not there anymore, right? So a people pleaser might struggle with boundaries, and codependent person might struggle with general sense of self. So for people pleasing can be like, okay, I don't want conflict, so I'm gonna do something that this person wants. But codependency is like, I really don't know who I am outside of this relationship. So people pleasing can happen in like specific situations, for example, specific context for people, whereas codependency tends to affect all areas of life. So a person can, for example, people please at work or with friends or in contact with some kind of authority figure, but still, for example, have healthy romantic relationships, let's say. But when it comes to codependency, a codependent person usually struggles deeply in all areas. So in romantic relationships, in family dynamics, with friends, struggling with self-worth and so on. So in a way, it goes deeper than people pleasing, because people pleasers would say, okay, I will make you happy. So I will do what I can to make you happy. But for the codependent, it's like your emotional state dictates how I feel. So determines my emotional state. So the codependent people can absorb emotions from others. They can over monitor others, try to control things. They can feel responsible for fixing others, savior complex, right? They can, I don't know, like feel anxious where the other person pulls away and so on. Welcome to the anxious attachment style. I spoke about it already on the podcast before, if someone doesn't know what it is. And they cannot really fully emotionally separate themselves from the other person. So not all the people pleasers are codependent, but most codependent people are people pleasers, right? So yeah. Having said that, narcissism and codependency, it's actually the opposite strategies to get the same result, which is love, safety, validation, control in our life somehow. But narcissistic strategy, it's like, I'll protect myself by focusing on me and not give a shit about you. Whereas the codependent strategy is like, I will protect myself by focusing on you and giving myself up. So they are both trying to avoid rejection, shame, abandonment, feeling like they are not worthy of love, but they are just doing it in a different way. So the codependent person, it's not like they are too caring or too nice and so on, because this is a misconception in our world where, oh, codependent is like too nice and so on. And like many people that are codependent are like, oh, yeah, I just love him too much. Oh, I care too much and so on. But then they end up helping when it's not necessary, trying to fix someone, caretaking, and people pleasing, as I mentioned before, to just like maintain the security in a relationship that they want so much. So the focus on others is a subconscious strategy to actually get their needs met indirectly, so they can manipulate people, right? In the same way that narcissists will manipulate people. So codependent people are narcissistic. And that's why sometimes in relationships, when you are codependent in one dynamic with one person, you can actually flip to being narcissistic in another dynamic, depending on the polarity of this other person that you're with. So everyone is somewhere on the spectrum of being codependent and narcissists, because we all have all parts of us inside. So everyone has a little bit of narcissist and a little bit of codependent inside. But depending on the childhood and what gave us more safety and validation and approval in childhood, we identified with one part and display this part in adulthood way more than the other part. But everyone has these parts inside. So codependency is this whole relational strategy where I lose myself to maintain connection with you. And how that can play out in relationships, we can have no clear identity, not know who we are, we can mirror others all the time, we can be super, super scared of disappointing people and then act not in alignment with our values. We can have chronic guilt in our body. We can attract emotionally unavailable people, yeah, which narcissists, because it's kind of like the opposite. So we are attracting what we suppress inside, and we can be just unable to say no to people, and we actually feel really low self-worth, and it's tied to being needed in a relationship. So yeah, we might have difficulties also to know how we really feel because we constantly care about the needs of others. And so it's worth mentioning also that many high performing men are actually codependent, also because if they have Enneagram 3, which is achiever, they have a wing, which is secondary personality 2, which is a giver. And then they can, for example, become successful in order to earn love, right? To get shit done, to feel worthy of love, and then become emotionally shut down because the vulnerability felt unsafe in childhood, and they can seek external validation constantly, and they can rescue their partners, the women especially, financially or emotionally for the sake as well, and they can feel worthless, that they are not productive and effective and they don't get shit done. So yeah, a lot of people that are high achievers, it could be a survival strategy for them to constantly take things off and accomplish more and more goals. So in a way, there can be codependency, but also narcissism hidden in this I need to achieve more patterns. Because narcissism is also misunderstood, and I spoke about narcissism also before, but underneath this like overpowering and this grandiosity that the narcissist wants to display outside, there is big shame, which also the codependent has, feeling unworthy, emotional deprivation, right? And then fear of dependency, vulnerability, rejection, and so on. So of course the narcissist is like, oh, if I need nobody, no one can hurt me. So for high performers, they can also just over focus on work, in this case, if they have narcissistic tendencies, because then it's such a nice strategy to avoid going into any relational dynamics and then risk being hurt. So it's easier to just focus on ourselves and just control everyone to have our needs met as a narcissist in this case, rather than facing the vulnerability that is beneath. And both narcissists and codependents manipulate, okay? Both. They just do it completely differently, right? So many codependent people or people pleasers see themselves as victims, you know, because this person used me, this person took more than they gave me. Okay, but you are the one who allowed it. And narcissistic manipulation is more overt, right? It's seen. It looks like dominance, like control, like charm, and so on. But the codependent manipulation is more covert. So then it's based on self-sacrifice, guilt, helplessness, rescuing, yeah, savior complex, and silent expectations, and so on. So actually, it's the same. It's just different sides trying to do the same, to cover their shame, to cover their guilt, to cover their emotional vulnerability. And actually, both narcissistic and codependent people are disconnected from their authenticity, right? And then they are deeply attracted to each other. Why? Because one over focuses on self and the other over focuses on other. So in a way, their dynamic temporarily, but still fits, right? Because if I'm the center of my attention and for you, I'm also the center of my attention, it kind of works, right? So the codependent gives and adapts and tolerates everything about the narcissist and chases, right? And the narcissist is like, okay, I'm here. I'm going to control the environment. I'm going to receive. I'm going to dominate. I'm going to overpower to get my needs met. Until, of course, eventually there is so much built resentment, so much anger, so much emotional starvation in this dynamic that it cannot work anymore. And then it collapses because it's not healthy, right? It's a toxic dynamic. What I want to add to it is that codependency is not the same as dependency, because people confuse this codependency definition as if someone is too dependent on their partner on specific things. But the reality is we cannot actually be independent, because if we want to eat food, we are dependent on people who prepare and grow and give us food, right? We are, as humans, relationally dependent. So we are going to be dependent on the other person, especially if it's our partner and we live with them. So we want to create interdependence, not lack of dependence in our relationship dynamic, because the healing is not like, I don't need anybody, I'm okay by myself, because that's suppressing the part of us that is still human and still has needs based on childhood that they want to meet. So rather than like swinging from codependency to then emotionally isolate and be like, I don't need anyone, we want to find a common ground, a win-win scenario, and discover how can I depend on my partner and how they can depend on me in ways that doesn't create toxic dynamics, but that creates mutual care and holds good and healthy boundaries, and both people can be authentic in their relationship, and there is reciprocity and freedom within the relationship, and that creates even deeper connection and intimacy between people. So yeah, it might be in a way some work to be done if we are in this codependent and narcissistic dynamic, because if we want to heal codependency, for example, we need to grieve a lot, right? And I used to be codependent, now I'm not anymore, but we need to grieve the childhood in which we didn't actually receive love, and we need to face the reality that maybe one or some of our caregivers in childhood didn't actually love us, or didn't love us unconditionally and it was only conditional, or we need to accept that there were so many unmet needs in our childhood, and we need to grieve in a way the identity and see who we have had to become in order to survive in our family dynamics. So it is a deep process, and without grieving that, what I just mentioned, people will repeat the same cycles, potentially endlessly, for their whole life. Because if you don't release the emotional charge that was programmed in your nervous system since childhood, and then you keep it stuck in your body, doesn't matter when you're codependent or narcissistic, you need to do the same. Just releasing the emotional charge, reprogramming your nervous system so it doesn't react in the same way towards people and doesn't attract the same type of person to your life anymore again. Because otherwise, yeah, we can just end up with the same person in different body and not know why we keep attracting these people. So the goal here is to take the other part. So in every relationship, we need to look at ourselves and be like, okay, are we selfish in this dynamic? Because both narcissist and codependent person are selfish if they are still in the patterns. And so it's about not being selfish, but take this other person as a power view and not abandon them also, and also not abandon yourself. So always look for a win-win in every situation. How can I maintain true to myself while also maintaining true and do my best to fulfill the needs of the other person? And so there are a few questions that we can ask ourselves to actually discover what our dynamic is and how we feel in this. So we can ask ourselves, okay, do I feel responsible for other people's emotions? Yes or no? And then to which degree? Because there are various degrees of being responsible for that. Do I struggle to know what I want and what I need in my relationships? Do I feel extremely guilty when I set boundaries and speak my truth? Do I overgive, overfunction in my relationships? Do I feel valuable and worthy of love only when I'm needed by the other person? Do I confuse being needed with being loved? Do I secretly hope that people will love me if I sacrifice enough, if I give myself up enough? Or am I attracted to emotionally unavailable people? All of these questions can help you realize whether you have these patterns and some of these dynamics inside. And just want to say at the end that codependency doesn't mean that someone is weak, because some people perceive people who are codependent as weak because they give themselves up, sacrifice, and so on. But it's just the proof that at some point in your life, adapting to others was safer than maintaining your own center and be yourself. So also narcissism is not that someone is evil. Narcissism happens when someone decided long time ago in childhood that needing people to meet my needs is dangerous, or it's not even going to happen because they don't care about me. So both narcissism and codependency are trauma adaptations, and they can actually be healed if people, of course, want to do it, because if you don't want to do it, it's not going to happen. But both of these patterns are attempts to survive the relational pain that they felt in their childhood. And both can be really shifted through awareness, through safety, through authenticity, through healthy connection, and through working with the subconscious mind. Because every program that we have in our adulthood and stemming from childhood is ingrained within us in our subconscious mind. So when we do, for example, the work that I do, doing belief work with a modality called Psych-K, inducing whole brain state to the state of super learning, or doing trauma work, working with your inner child, or doing parts work, discovering the internal conflicts between subconscious parts of you, which I already talked about before on previous podcast episodes. If you work on your subconscious mind, on all these beliefs that you don't know that you have, all these relational patterns that are imprinted in your body, then you can become more and more whole within, more authentic to yourself, state your boundaries better, and not act neither like a narcissism nor like a codependent person. It requires some time and some work and some energy, of course, like everything in life that we want to put our energy into, like training at the gym or something else. But it is absolutely possible to shift these patterns. And I see in me how much the subconscious mind work helped me to get out of the codependency that I used to have and to be way more centered, way more grounded, and way more happy and fulfilled with myself, just as I am. So I highly encourage to get into this kind of work if you see these patterns in yourself and if you see them in people around you. Because if you, for example, see that there is someone narcissistic in your family, it's also you who attracted this experience into your life. So it's you to decide how you're going to go about it and whether you're going to hold your boundaries. Send this episode to someone who needs to hear all that. And if you like it, then please leave a like or subscribe if you like my vibe. And if you want to know more about me or whatever I offer, you can go to my website, karolinakuraj.com, find everything about me and my contacts there. Karolina with K, Kuraj.com. And for now, thanks so much for listening, for being here with me, and see you in the next episode.